There is a disinformation program literally for everyone, no matter who you are and what your interests are, what your beliefs are, which way you're focusing. There is a website set up just for you to take you in and to vector your thinking and your attention into the way that they want you to think.
You are listening to Radio Free Signs of the Times, broadcasting into the heart of an occupied America.
Welcome to this week's Signs of the Times podcast. I'm Henry.
I'm Joe.
I'm Scott.
And once more, we're sitting down with Laura. Welcome back, Laura.
Thank you.
And we're dipping into the mailbag for the second week in a row. This week, we are going to be looking at the very general questions we get about, please talk about In Search of the Miraculous, please talk about Gurdjieff. So, that's what we're going to try to do today. Obviously, it is a vast subject, and we'll only be able to touch on certain aspects of it. If you have questions, please go to the Signs of the Times forum and leave them for us. And if you can be a little more specific than just, please talk about In Search of the Miraculous, that might help us a little more to focus in on some of the questions that you have. In Search of the Miraculous is the title. Well, it's the title that the English publishers gave to a book written by Peter Uspensky. The original title was Fragments of an Unknown Teaching. Fragments of an Unknown Teaching better sums up what the real content of the book is, because it only kind of scratches the surface of what Gurdjieff was about, and it only scratches the surface of the teachings of esoteric Christianity, which form a part of the teachings that inspired Gurdjieff. Uspensky met Gurdjieff in Russia in, about 1913, 1914? The discussions in the book are Uspensky's summaries of Gurdjieff's teachings during the few years that Gurdjieff was teaching in Russia. When the Russian Revolution occurred in 1917, Gurdjieff took his pupils and left and began wandering for several years and ended up living the rest of his life in France. By the time Gurdjieff got to Europe, Uspensky had broken with him. And so the teachings that you find in the book are only covering that few years that Uspensky was actually Gurdjieff's student. There is another book entitled Struggle of the Magicians that was written by William Patrick Patterson, which goes into some detail over the relationship between Uspensky and Gurdjieff over the years, and discusses particularly how Gurdjieff was trying to work with Uspensky, who was a very intelligent man. He had done quite a bit of work on his own. He had set out on explorations of his own to find this knowledge that he knew existed. But he had a certain amount of pride, and his intellectual center was very, very highly developed. And Gurdjieff spent quite a bit of time trying to break through the rational side of Uspensky and trying to awaken his emotional center. We know in our society that it is people's intellectual centers that are trained. Moraviev talks about this quite a bit in his work, Gnosis. And so Gurdjieff was focusing on Uspensky and trying to break through the personality that was entirely based in Uspensky's intellectual center. And Uspensky had so much self-importance and pride that he wasn't able to let go. And he began to think that he understood the system better than Gurdjieff himself, and misinterpreted what Gurdjieff was doing with him in a way that he thought Gurdjieff was trying to provoke devotion and ritual and some sort of almost a religious following among his students. And he didn't see that this was just the particular way that Gurdjieff was trying to work with Uspensky to break down and get his emotional center awakened. So this led to a break. nonetheless, In Search of the Miraculous is a book that everyone should read because it is a very faithful account of the way Gurdjieff was teaching back in Russia prior to the revolution, and the way that he did work with his students. The book is rich with knowledge, and we'll only talk about some of the ideas that are in there today, and we'll try to put it in the context of the work that we are doing. Those of you who know us through Signs of the Times know that we are keeping an eye on the world day to day, trying to arrive at as objective a look at the world as is possible. The way we put it is, how would the universe see itself?
Well, that's a very good question, Henry. The first thing I would like to say is that in regards to the book itself, In Search of the Miraculous, it was written before Uspensky died, and he completed it and then said that it should never be published. It was his wish that it never be published. After his death, his wife, who was still very much in contact with and favorable towards Gurdjieff, gave the manuscript to Gurdjieff for his comments. After reading the entire manuscript, apparently his remark was that Uspensky had a very good memory, and he had no real criticisms of anything that had been written in the book. So I think that we can rely on it for a good record of what Gurdjieff conveyed to Uspensky during that period of time, and that it essentially did get Gurdjieff's more or less tacit seal of approval as an accurate record of that information, as well as those times, and also that we can also be thankful that Uspensky's wife decided to publish it even against Uspensky's wishes, because it was way too important to be suppressed. And certainly one has to wonder why Uspensky would have wished to suppress this record, because there were clear differences in how Uspensky saw the teaching and how Gurdjieff, or what Gurdjieff was really after, his particular aim. And I think the most important thing for anybody who is interested in understanding Gurdjieff, what he was about, what he was trying to do, is to try to find out, what happened to him that gave him the ideas that he had, what was his aim, what was his objective, what were the particular circumstances and context in which he had his ideas. Because, of course, there's a lot of conjecture about the particular teachings. People say that, Gurdjieff got it from the Sufis, he got it from the Eastern Orthodox tradition, he got it from some secret school in Siberia, that he, borrowed from here and stole from there and plagiarized this and so on. I mean, a lot of very uncomplimentary things have been said about Gurdjieff, and I don't think that it's entirely fair. Gurdjieff himself gives us an account of where, when, and how his ideas, or the fundament of his ideas, came to him, and it's in a little book called Life is Real, Only Then When I Am. And this is the third book in his All and Everything series, and I would like to just read a little bit from this book to give you an idea, and I'll make some comments as I go along. In the foreword to the book, Life is Real, Gurdjieff is quoted as having said about this particular book, quote, "My last book, through which I wish to share with other creatures of our common Father, similar to myself, almost all the previously unknown mysteries of the inner world of man, which I have accidentally learned." Madame de Salzman, who edited and published this book, tells us that Gurdjieff wrote these words on the 6th of November, 1934, and immediately started to work. For the next few months, he devoted himself entirely to working out his ideas for this book. Then suddenly, on the 2nd of April in 1935, he completely stopped writing. Why did he leave this third series unfinished and apparently give up his intention to publish it? He let it be clearly understood on the last page of Beelzebub's Tales that the third series would be accessible only to those who would be selected as capable of understanding, quote, the genuine objective truths which he will bring to light. Before he died, Madame de Salzmann tells us, Gurdjieff sent for me to tell me how he saw the state of affairs and to give me certain instructions. He said, publish as and when you are sure the time has come. Publish the first and second series. But the essential thing, the first thing, is to prepare a nucleus of people capable of responding to the demand which will arise. So long as there is no responsible nucleus, of human beings that is, the action of the ideas will not go beyond a certain threshold. That will take time, a lot of time. And then he said, to publish the third series is not necessary. It was written for another purpose. Nevertheless, if you believe you ought to do so, one day publish it. Now, what I would like you to really pay attention to is what Gurdjieff said to the caretaker of his legacy, Madame de Salzmann. He said, let me repeat, the essential thing, the first thing, is to prepare a nucleus of people capable of responding to the demand which will arise. Now, I have commented on this elsewhere in writing that I think that when Gurdjieff said this, that he was having something of a prophetic moment because, of course, with his ability to observe human nature and his knowledge of history and historical cycles, it was pretty clear that he knew that there was going to be a need arising, and he did, of course, know some secrets that the rest of us don't really have access to. The question is, of course, how did he come by these secrets? What did he know? What did he really understand? Now, you notice also that she says that he wrote these words on the 6th of November, 1934, the 6th of November. It's an interesting day because, in fact, he refers to the 6th of November in the text of the book itself, the book Life is Real Only Then When I Am. In this book, he talks about the actual event, the context in which he came to his ideas about how to do things, what to do, what was necessary, in which he basically invented his concept of so-called self-remembering or self-observation. And I think that there are an awful lot of people who claim to follow the Gurdjieff work who haven't read this passage carefully enough and haven't really understood its import, because this tells us an enormous amount of what it was that made Gurdjieff the way he was, why he thought what he did, and how he came to his conclusions, and basically gives us a model for how we ourselves can arrive at similar states of being as Gurdjieff achieved himself. In this book, he's talking about many of his travels and his experiences, and of course, those of you who are familiar with the story of Gurdjieff know that he was wounded on several occasions and exposed to great danger, sometimes because of foolhardiness, and other times because he just happened to be traveling in parts of the world searching for answers, and those parts of the world were being subjected to revolutions, to tribal fighting, to wars, to all kinds of human folly, man killing other men. And these were the kinds of conditions that Gurdjieff was experiencing when he came to the ideas that he came to. So he says in this book, and I'm going to quote, he says, after overcoming with unimaginable difficulties every kind of great and small obstacle, I came to the city of Yangisar in the former Chinese Turkestan, where, from old friends of mine, I supplied myself with money and found myself in that same place where I had lived several years before, while recovering my health when it had been shattered because of a stray bullet number 2. This place is located on the southwestern edge of the Gobi Desert and represents, to my mind, the most fertile of all the parts of the surface of our earth. And concerning the air of this place and its salutary influence on everyone inhaling it, I will say that it is truly purgatorial. Now, I don't know if he meant purgatorial in the sense of purgatory, or if he meant that it purged a person of other influences. However, this was the word he used, purgatorial. He writes further, if in reality there exists paradise and hell, and if from them arise any kinds of radiation, then the air in the space between these two sources, that is, paradise and hell, would surely have to be similar to this. For on one side is a soil which almost literally pours from itself as from a cornucopia, all kinds of earthly flora, fauna, and right next to this fertile soil is an area of many thousands of square kilometers representing literally hell, where not only nothing crops up, but anything originating elsewhere that gets into its midst is destroyed in a very short time, leaving no trace. And he's speaking, of course, of the Gobi Desert. Namely, here on this small singular piece of the hard surface of our earth, the air of which, that is, our second food, and Gurdjieff referred to air as a form of food, originates and is transformed between the forces of paradise and hell. In me there had proceeded at the end of my first visit there, which he referred to just above, right at the time he was recovering from a stray bullet number 2. In me had proceeded at the end of my first visit there an almost delirious condition, just that same self-reasoning concerning which, in my consciousness, on the evening of November 6th, as I have mentioned above, there flashed an idea which appeared to me then entirely absurd. Now, what he's saying is that he began working on this book, Life is Real, on November 6th, more or less in a commemoration of the date of the event when he first had the idea for that what formed the foundation of his work. And I don't think, many people pay an awful lot of attention to these, small, curious little facts. But in any event, he's going to tell us here exactly what happened to him. On November 6th, there flashed an idea which appeared to me then entirely absurd. He says, the first time my friends brought me here in an unconscious condition, soon after I had been wounded by the second stray bullet. At the beginning, there were friends, and after the return of consciousness, and I began to improve, all of them gradually went away, and there were only 2 people left looking after him, a Tibetan and a very young Kyrgyz. So he was living there, far from people of all sorts, attended by 2 sympathetic people who treated me almost maternally, and all the time nourished by that above-mentioned cleansing air. I, within 6 weeks, recovered so that I already wished and was able at any moment to leave this place. Everything was gathered, so they were packed up and they were awaiting the arrival of the camels, the little caravan that was going to take him away from this place. He continues, I was by that time, though not yet entirely, as it is said, strong on my feet, I was already feeling quite well. It was night. The full moon was out. Thinking along paths of current associations, unnoticeably my thoughts passed again to the question which by this time had become finally transformed into the idée fixe of my inner world. Continuing to think about this under the influence from one side of a distant hollow din formed from the sounds of millions of lives of all possible outer forms, and on the other side of an awesome silence, in me gradually arose in relation to myself a critical faculty of unprecedented strength. At the beginning, there were recollected in me all of my blunders in my former searches, while from one side I constated my blunders, and in general the imperfections of the methods previously applied by me from the other side, it became clear how I ought to have acted in this or that instance. I remember very well how my strength waned from these tense thoughts, and during this some part of me time and again ordered me to get up quickly, rouse myself in order to stop such thoughts. But this I could not do, so strongly had I been involved in these same thoughts. Now, let's stop right here and consider what Gurdjieff is describing here. He is describing his first real conscious experience or awareness of the fact that he was actually self-remembering himself, that he was doing the very thing upon which he based his entire work for the rest of his life. Let me read it one more time, what he was doing, what he was thinking. While from one side I constated my blunders, and in general the imperfections of the methods previously applied by me, from the other side it became clear how I ought to have acted in this or that instance. This is the beginning of the process of self-remembering. to take an inventory of your life, to really look at it in a cold, clear, clean way, to see how each action you have taken led to another action or to a reaction from another individual or from life itself, and to examine it in its full context with full knowledge, and to understand, what you ought to have done that would have made things different. Because in many cases, I am sure that everyone knows that in any given instance, when they say or do something and something painful or unpleasant occurs, after the fact, they realize what they should have done. There's an old saying, hindsight is 20/20. What Gurdjieff is here talking about is applying this 20/20 hindsight. I mean, an actual application of 20/20 hindsight. But let's go on and see what else he did with this. He says, I don't know with what this would have ended if at the moment when instinctively I began to feel that I must lose consciousness, the 3 camels near me had not sat down. At this, I came to myself and got up. By this time, day was already dawning. Awake also were my young companions, who were busying themselves with the usual preparations for morning life in the desert. After talking with the old man, we decided to take advantage of the moonlight and set out on the evening. Moreover, the camels could rest well during the day. But instead of lying down to sleep, I took with me a rifle and a traveling pail made of canvas, and I went to a nearby spring of very cold water on the very edge of the desert. Undressing, I began very slowly to pour this cold water over me. After this, though I felt quite well mentally, physically I became so weak that after dressing I was compelled to lie down there near the spring. Now pay close attention here. And then, being so weak physically and very well refreshed mentally, there proceeded in me that same self-reasoning, the essence of which became impressed in my consciousness forever, and concerning which, on that evening of November 6th, flashed the mentioned idea. Due to its remoteness, I do not remember the exact words of that first self-reasoning, so discordant with my usual general state. But having preserved in myself the, so to say, taste of it, I can recollect it exactly, though in different words. It consisted of the following. Now, here you're going to be hearing what Gurdjieff is recounting as what was going through his mind during this moment of intense mental clarity, this transformative moment. This is the thing that made Gurdjieff who he was and what he was and drove him to do what he did. So this is something that is extremely important. Pay close attention. He was thinking, judging by my fitness during the last few days, it seems I again have come to life and willy-nilly will have to drag on and drudge as before. My God, is it possible that I will have to experience again all that I have lived through during the periods of my fully collected active state for the last half year before this last misfortune of mine? In short, he is wondering, do I have to just continue on the way I have been going? I mean, is this all there is to life? Is that, I mean, just this pain and suffering and misery, this striving and struggling and seeking and being afflicted by the arrows of misfortune and so forth. So this is what he's thinking. And I'm sure that most people have thought this at one time or another. Not only to experience feelings alternating almost regularly between remorse for the inner and outer manifestations of my ordinary waking state, and loneliness, disappointment, satiation, and the rest, but primarily to be everywhere haunted by the fear of inner emptiness. What also have I not done? What resources have I not exhausted in my determination to reach a state where the functioning of my psyche and my usual waking state would flow in accordance with the previous instructions of my active consciousness? But all in vain. In my past life, being forever merciless to my natural weaknesses, and almost all the time jealously keeping watch over myself, I could attain almost anything within the limits of man's possibilities, and in some fields attained even to such a degree of power as not one man, perhaps, not even in any past epoch, has ever attained. For instance, the development of the power of my thoughts had been brought to such a level that by only a few hours of self-preparation I could, from a distance of tens of miles, kill a yak. Or in 24 hours, I could accumulate life forces of such compactness that I could in 5 minutes put to sleep an elephant. At the same time, in spite of all my desires and endeavors, I could not succeed in remembering myself in the process of my general common life with others so as to be able to manifest myself, not according to my nature, but according to the previous instructions of my collected consciousness.
Now that is such an important point, because right there you've got the whole split that we see in so many teachings, these people focusing on phenomena. You've got Gurdjieff, who says he had these tremendous powers that he had developed, which could be similar to the kinds of things that you hear gurus and teachers claiming that they can develop in their students. And in spite of all of this, he saw that in a sense he was completely empty and he had achieved nothing at all.
As he says, I could not attain the state of remembering myself, and that is remembering these profound ideas that had passed through his mind about, being able to, the hindsight is 20/20, knowing what you were doing as opposed to what you should and ought to do. He's saying that he was not even able to remember what he ought to do in any given situation because he was behaving more or less automatically. All the things he had done automatically, as opposed to this clarity of vision where he saw what he ought to have done and had vowed to himself that from now on he would do what he ought to do instead of being ruled by this automatic behavior. And here he's saying, I am able to kill a yak with the power of my mind or put to sleep an elephant. And I cannot even remember to do myself what I ought to do based on that deep level of conscious awareness that I know I can achieve, but which goes away from me, which leaves me at the mercy of my mechanical behavior.
Yeah, it's from that springs his Gurdjieff's concept of doing, with a capital D, of being able to do, and where he repeatedly says that ordinary man cannot do anything. And in doing, obviously doing does not refer to the normal activities of the ordinary life of the average person, and does not refer to being able to kill a yak from so many miles and not being able to put an elephant to sleep. That is not what Gurdjieff defines as doing. So
he describes doing as being able to do what you ought to do.
Mm-hmm. But that's still a little bit ambiguous.
Yes, it's still a little bit ambiguous. But in any event, he says, I could not attain the state of remembering myself even sufficiently to hinder the associations flowing in me automatically from certain undesirable hereditary factors of my nature. As soon as the accumulation of energy which enabled me to be in an active state was exhausted, at once associations of both thoughts and feelings began to flow in the direction of objects diametrically opposed to the ideals of my consciousness. When I found myself in a state of complete dissatisfaction with food and sex, the leading factor of these associations of mine appeared to be primarily vindictiveness. And in a state of full satisfaction, they proceeded on a theme of the forthcoming pleasure of a meal and sex, or of the gratification of self-love, vanity, pride, jealousy, and other passions. I thought deeply myself and tried to find out from others about the reasons for such a terrible situation within my inner world, but could not clarify anything at all. From one side, it is clear that it is necessary to remember myself during the process of ordinary life also. In other words, to have this deep and intense state of awareness, of being able to see, that part of you that would go along and do things this way, and then that other part of you that would be able to observe and say, no, that's not what you ought to do. This is what you ought to do. That hindsight part of yourself, to bring it into actuality on a continual basis. This is what he's talking about. From one side, it is clear that it is necessary to remember myself during the process of ordinary life, and from the other side, that there is a necessity for the presence of attentiveness, which is able to merge in case of contact with others. So he's talking about having this intense state of self-awareness of the hindsight 20/20 view of the self, as well as still being able to be attentive to the world itself, to the environment, and to other people within it. To have, a highly manifested state of being. This is what he's talking about. Though in my past life I had tried everything, even had worn reminding factors of all kinds on my person, nothing helped. Perhaps these did help a little while I carried them on me, but if so, it was only at the beginning. As soon as I stopped carrying them, or got used to them, in a moment it was as before. There is no way out whatsoever. However, there is one exit only: to have outside myself a never-sleeping regulating factor, namely, a factor which will remind me always, in my every common state, to remember myself. But what is this? Can it really be so? A new thought. Why, hitherto, could there not have come to my head such a simple thought? Did I have to suffer and despair so much in order only now to think of such a possibility? Why could I not, in this instance, also look to a universal analogy? And here is our universal analogy. There is God. Only He is everywhere, and with Him everything is connected. I am a man, and as such I am, in contrast to all other outer forms of animal life, created by Him in His image. For He is God, and therefore I also have within myself all the possibilities and impossibilities that He has. The difference between God and myself must lie only in scale. For He is God of all the presences in the universe. It follows then that I also have to be God of some kind of presence at my own scale. I am God also, although only of my inner world. He is God, and I am God. For all and in everything we have the same possibilities and impossibilities. Whatever is possible or impossible in the sphere of His great world should be possible or impossible in the sphere of the small world of an individual man. This is as clear as that after the night must inevitably come the day. But how could I have failed to notice such a startling analogy? I had thought so much about world creation, world maintenance, and in general about God and His deeds, and had discoursed with many others about all these matters, but never once had there come to me this simple thought, and yet it could not be otherwise. Everything, without exception, all sound logic as well as all historical data, reveal and affirm that God represents goodness. He is all-loving, all-forgiving. He is the just pacifier of all that exists. At the same time, why should He, being as He is, send away from Himself one of His nearest, by Him animated, beloved sons, only for the way of pride, proper to any young and still completely formed individual, and bestow upon him a force equal but opposite to his own? I refer here to the devil. This idea illuminated the condition of my inner world like the sun, and rendered it obvious that in the great world, for the possibility of harmonious construction, there was inevitably required some kind of continuous perpetuation of this reminding factor. For this reason, our Maker Himself, in the name of all that He had created, was compelled to place one of His beloved sons in such an, in the objective sense, invidious situation. Therefore, I also have now for my small inner world to create out of myself, from some factor beloved by me, an alike unending source. There arises now a question. What is there contained in my general presence which, if I should remove it from myself, would always in my various general states be reminding me of itself? Thinking and thinking, I came to the conclusion that if I should intentionally stop utilizing the exceptional powers in my possession, which had been developed by me consciously in my common life with people, then there must be forced out of me such a reminding source, namely the power based upon strength in the field as it would be called by others, the power of telepathy and hypnotism. Thanks mainly to this, my inherency, developed in me by myself, I, in the process of general life, especially for the last 2 years, had been spoiled and depraved to the core, so that most likely this would remain for all my life. And so if consciously I would deprive myself of this grace of my inherency, then undoubtedly always and in everything its absence would be felt. So, Gurdjieff is proposing to himself that he make a vow that he should do a certain thing, and that he should stick to this vow to deprive himself of something that he refers to as his power of telepathy and hypnotism, which he had used for survival to get things he needed, wanted, sex, money, resources, etc. Now, the equivalent of this in the ordinary human state is to vow to deprive ourselves of our games, of our manipulations, of our self-deceptions, our lies to ourselves, our lies to other people, and to continuously thereby remind ourselves of who and what we are, essentially and in our core.
The trouble that we have with that is that Gurdjieff appears to have been conscious of his the powers that he's speaking of. He was conscious of the way that he used those powers to get what he needed. And when we look at ourselves, we are, in most cases, completely unconscious of the games that we play, of the programs that we're running, of the manipulations that we're doing. So you have to come to the first step where you say, what are they? And you have to learn to identify them.
But that's part of the what Gurdjieff talked about in terms of self-remembering and looking back at his at your situations in the past where you've done certain things and assigning to that situation the objective reality, because people will look back at certain events in their life and will generally try to find a way to excuse themselves of any wrongdoing, of any manipulation, and project the blame or just muddy the waters in some way to excuse themselves. And it's this kind of harsh, critical look at ourselves that is first required, as Henry's stating.
And we use those things to get what we want, get what we need. And here is where he actually addresses that. He says, I take an oath to remember never to make use of this inherency of mine, these powers, and thereby to deprive myself from satisfying most of my vices. In the process of living together with others, this beloved inherency will always be a reminder for me. Never so long as I live shall I forget what state of mind resulted then, when, on the last day of my presence in that place, there happened the above-given self-reasoning, which terminated in the conclusions which I have given above. As soon as I realized the sense of this idea, I was as if reincarnated. I got up and began to run around the spring without knowing what I was doing, like a young calf. It all ended thus, that I decided to take an oath before my own essence, in a state of mind known to me, never again to make use of this property of mine. I must also mention that when I took the oath not to apply in life this inherency, I made a reservation that my oath should not concern the application of it for scientific purposes. For instance, I was very much interested then, and even now my interest has not entirely vanished. And listen carefully to this. In increasing the visibility of distant cosmic centers many thousand times through the use of a medium, and in the cure of cancer by the power of suggestion. Now, Gurdjieff has said right here that seeing through the use of a medium was one of his main interests. And one wonders why the use of a medium, the use of seeing via a medium, the use of his powers for this purpose has been so completely ignored by those so-called followers of Gurdjieff.
Well, the way he describes it certainly reminds me of another experiment that somebody has been conducting over the last 14 or 12 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there isn't much reference to that, as you say, by followers of Gurdjieff, and there isn't much. I mean, I don't think he explains anywhere exactly the nature of his
ideas.
Of his mediumistic, channeling, if you want to call it that. But maybe that word channeling is the problem. And around the time, the beginning of the 20th century, with the whole spiritism and spiritualism and the table tipping and the mediumistic kind of sessions that were going on. I mean, a lot of that has come in, or at the time it was come in for a lot of disrepute and criticism, and it became something of a farce with staged sessions of this nature. So it may be understandable that he didn't want to exactly kind of highlight or to involve himself in that milieu because of the nature of it.
There's that aspect of it, and there's also the aspect that people use it as a crutch. People use it as something out there is going to save me. And
because he says what he's talking about here is the power of telepathy and hypnotism, and I made a reservation that he could apply this, that is, the power of telepathy and hypnotism, scientifically, in increasing the visibility of distant cosmic centers many thousand times through the use of a medium. And then he finally concludes this discussion of what was the foundation of his ideas and his work by saying, "Toward the end of this second sojourn in my being, the basic aim of almost all my life split into two definite aspects. And this time also, thanks to my unhindered free mentation, that is, mentation which proceeded without the effects of the automatic influences of other people. The trouble is that until this time, the aim of my inner world had been concentrated on only my one unconquerable desire, which was to investigate from all sides and to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man. Until this time in my life, every activity into which I had rushed, every failure or success, had been connected with this sole, the singular aim of my inner world. Even my propensity during this period for traveling and trying to place myself wherever in the process of the mutual existence of people, there proceeded sharp energetic events, such as civil war, revolutions, etc., had sprung from this, my sole aim, which was to investigate from all sides and to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man. I had collected material for clearing up the problems of my principal aim in a more concentrated form, and therefore more productively." So he is telling us here that he did collect a great deal of information from many sources. Secondly, as a result of the memory in my automatic mentation of the sight of all sorts of terrors flowing from the violent events which I had witnessed, and finally from accumulated impressions arising from conversations with various revolutionaries in the previous several years, first in Italy, then in Switzerland, and more recently in Transcaucasia, there had crystallized in me little by little, besides the previous unique aim, another also unconquerable aim. Now I want to stop and just comment on the fact that he is mentioning here another thing, another insight on what he was going through when he was thinking of all of these things that he had done in the past and what he ought to have done, or so forth, that when he was in this process of so-called self-remembering what he was thinking about. He says, "The result of the memory in my automatic mentation of the sight of all sorts of terrors flowing from the violent events which I had witnessed, and from accumulated impressions arising from conversations with various revolutionaries in the previous several years." Now, horrors and conversations with revolutionaries are what crystallized in him this new second aim that was in addition to his previous aim, which was to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man. So what was this new aim? This other newly arisen aim of my inner world can be summed up in this: that I must discover at all costs some manner or means for destroying in people the predilection for suggestibility, which causes them to fall easily under the influence of mass hypnosis. And then we think again of the fact that he applied his abilities to increasing the visibility of distant cosmic centers many thousands of times through the use of the medium. And then the thing with which we began this little examination of what was going on with Gurdjieff, that he said, note carefully the dying words of Gurdjieff. The essential thing, the first thing, is to prepare a nucleus of people capable of responding to the demand which will arise. And one suspects that Gurdjieff saw a great deal that perhaps no one was ever privy to. And if there was someone who was privy to it, they certainly have not revealed it, because these clues indicate to us that there was much more to what Gurdjieff was doing than is generally propagated by those people claiming to be followers of the so-called Fourth Way.
And we can end this discussion here for the moment. We'll pick up in the next podcast. If you'd like to discuss any of the ideas that we have raised, you can come to the Signs of the Times forum. There is a link off of the Signs of the Times page at www.signs-of-the-times.org. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
There is a disinformation program, literally, for everyone, no matter who you are and what your interests are, what your beliefs are, which way you're focusing. There is a website set up just for you to take you in and to vector your thinking and your attention into the way that they want you to think.
You are listening to Radio Free Signs of the Times, broadcasting into the heart of an occupied America.
Welcome to this Signs of the Times podcast. I'm Henry.
I'm Joe.
I'm Scott.
And we're continuing our discussion with Laura.
Yes, thanks for having me.
In last week's podcast, we began a discussion of Gurdjieff. We were looking at some of the things that Gurdjieff wrote in his book, Life is Real. And Laura has been pulling out details that have been ignored or glossed over by pretty much everybody else. We began by looking at some of Gurdjieff's last words to Madame de Salzmann on his deathbed. He said to her about his writings, "The essential thing, the first thing, is to prepare a nucleus of people capable of responding to the demand which will arise." Laura made the comment that she felt that Gurdjieff was having something of a prophetic moment, that he was able to see something of the future and what was going to happen. He saw that there was going to be a need for the development of a group of people who were working to see the world as objectively as possible. She also pulled out an overlooked quote from the same book, Life is Real, where Gurdjieff was recounting an experience that he'd had on the 6th of November out in an area on the edge of the Gobi Desert. And during this account, he writes, "I was very much interested then, and even now my interest has not entirely vanished in increasing the visibility of distant cosmic centers many thousand times through the use of a medium. Well, when we read this, it brought to mind a certain other experiment that's been going on for the last few years, that Laura has been conducting, a scientific experiment, which is also the terms that Gurdjieff used. He was talking about his own telepathic abilities and how in this experience out in the desert or on the edge of the desert, he was looking for a way to achieve some sort of self-memory, self-remembrance, where he was able to look at himself, look at his life, see what he should have done in any moment, and use it to see what he should do in the present moment. He realized that the way to do this was to take this telepathic ability that he had developed, which had been his means of obtaining what he needed in life, this ability to influence people, and to say that he wasn't going to use it anymore for that purpose. And the one purpose that he allowed himself to continue to use it was in scientific investigation. And the scientific investigation, one of the instances or the examples that he gives is what I just mentioned: increasing the visibility of distant cosmic centers many thousand times through the use of a medium. So we'll pick up from there.
What is interesting about the way that he phrases this, distant cosmic centers, is the very fact that in our own experimental work, where we have the so-called Cassiopeian communication, they describe themselves as we are you in the future. And they talk about thought centers. And, of course, it is extremely distant cosmically speaking. So one can't help but wonder, or to draw a comparison between what Gurdjieff must have been doing using his abilities as a hypnotist and his telepathic abilities in this mediumistic enterprise, which nobody seems to be talking about if they are aware of it. And then, as I said last week, the result of these thoughts that he was having at that particular period of time was that his aims split into two main goals. He had, first of all, his primary aim, which was described as to investigate from all sides and to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man. And he now had the second aim, which was that he must discover at all costs some manner or means for destroying in people the predilection for suggestibility which caused them to fall easily under the influence of mass hypnosis. The important point of this realization that Gurdjieff had, which so many people fail to really consider and to think about, is the fact that he tells us that he came to these ideas, he came to these understandings as the result of memories of the sight of all sorts of terrors flowing from the violent events which I had witnessed, and finally from accumulated impressions arising from conversations with various revolutionaries in the previous several years, and that these memories and conversations had crystallized in him, little by little, as he writes, besides the previous unique aim, that unconquerable aim to try to help people to learn how to overcome the influence of mass hypnosis.
Well, the first thing about that occurs to me is that it's a long way from Gurdjieff's description of I suppose, what we understand as spiritual work is a long way from the New Age navel gazing and ascension and various other kind of blissful states. I mean, he describes it as, his life was a very interesting one, a very hard one, where obviously he as he described himself, he underwent many difficult trials and got shot at least twice and had various other unpleasant experiences, and it was these experiences that brought him to this point of clarity and of understanding. And he also mentions that one of the things that brought him to this point was talking with revolutionaries and other people that were by a standard rule were very interesting and perhaps very very driven people. But then he follows that up by saying that this brought him to the second aim, which was to understand how to prevent people from falling foul of mass psychosis or hypnosis.
Well, and one has to think about, the perspective. I mean, to really understand what he must have been thinking, the perspective of a so-called revolutionary. A revolutionary is an individual, generally, who is seeking ways and means to revolt against a mass hypnosis. And obviously he was having conversations with them and their frustrations with achieving the goals of throwing off the yoke of mass hypnosis and mental domination and the power of the global elite were the concerns with which Gurdjieff was concerned. These are things that concern us today also.
Probably also saw that large numbers of those revolutionaries were perfectly willing to engage in the same sort of mass suggestibility that the other side was using, and he came to the understanding that this was a cycle that had to be broken out of.
Yeah, and the other thing is that maybe he may have met revolutionaries who themselves were victims of mass hypnosis, who were being controlled, and that, in effect, this idea that, we talk a lot on the science page about the idea of, overthrowing the Bush regime, and that this idea of changing this world is essentially can be a result of the propagation of illusion or a type of hypnosis where people think that if they can just take back the country and take back the government, everybody's going to be, the world's going to turn out fine and everything will be rosy.
Yes, exactly.
But these two things that he came to, the first are the two unconquerable aims that he spent his life or eventually tried to achieve. The first one being understanding the nature of the life of humanity, and the second one being how to prevent people from falling under this mass hypnosis. Perhaps what he kind of concluded or saw in stark reality was that if nothing's done, then the purpose of life on Earth, or the purpose of human life on Earth, is to simply be victimized or subjected to this mass hypnosis and used for whatever purposes the powers that be.
Well, then getting back to what you just said about the so-called New Age ways and means of achieving enlightenment, which is giving over your will to a belief system and contemplating your navel or chanting Om or just think nice thoughts or that sort of thing. Gurdjieff,
finding a fountain of bliss.
Yeah, Gurdjieff concludes this little discussion by saying, "So the idea which flashed into my consciousness on the evening of November 6th consisted of the following. In all probability, my experience during the last few days of horrible despair and the unusually intense struggle of inner forces which expressed itself this morning in an almost delirious self-reasoning is really nothing else than the direct outcome of the self-reasoning that transpired in me when in an almost similar state 30 years ago on the edge of the Gobi Desert. So when I had more or less recovered, I began just from here to continue my researches, but now for 2 definite aims instead of only one." And then he begins to discuss, how he undertook to do this, that he has already written in some detail in one of the books of the 3rd series of his writings, and he will say that only after some years I found it necessary to originate somewhere an institution for the preparation of helper instructors in order to be able to put into the lives of people what I had already learned. So he was in the process of doing this, and he had selected Russia to be the appropriate place for this purpose, and then, of course, the Russian Revolution arose. So that is what Gurdjieff talked about in terms of who he was and where he came from. Now, the problem is, as we've already mentioned, is that most people involved in fourth way works don't necessarily follow any of this sort of thing because, as it happens, we have several friends and members of our discussion groups, who are involved to some extent as a corollary activity with some Gurdjieffian type schools. We have a couple in the United States, and so we understand what kinds of work they do and what their focus is on, and we also have a couple in Europe, so that basically we have an insight into how the fourth way schools are following the so-called teachings of Gurdjieff. And from what we have been able to glean from this information is that some way, somehow, they seem to have really lost the essence of what Gurdjieff was really all about and what made him the way he was. Now, there is another interesting perspective on this. It comes from Carlos Casteneda in his book, The Fire from Within. Now, there's been a lot of discussion or argument or dispute about who or what Don Juan Mateus really was. Was he a real person? Was he a real teacher? Did Carlos Casteneda have contact with a real seer? Or was he just making things up? Because, of course, the last years of Casteneda's life, it became fairly obvious that whatever had happened to him wasn't a very good thing, because he went down a road that was not conducive to fulfilling any kinds of benevolent aims. Nevertheless, we can almost compare Casteneda to Ouspensky in the sense of the decline of their abilities, because neither of them was able to fully give up self-importance. I have always suspected that there was a combination of elements in what Casteneda wrote in his creation of Don Juan. I think that Don Juan may have been a real individual, but that he was also semi-mythical, that ideas that Casteneda himself formulated, or which came to him in a creative way, maybe even telepathically, were put into the mouth of Don Juan, in addition to, a possible real individual who did teach some things along a certain line. So I think that when you look at this, you have to look at it as a creative process. But the point is when you're reading it, to think about the fact that among the sources that Casteneda may have tapped for his work may, in fact, have been Gurdjieff himself. Because there are many things that come through in what Casteneda writes that are so similar to what Gurdjieff was writing, and of course the time period was such that he could easily have borrowed some of this information and incorporated it into his southwestern mythos, putting it into the mouth of Don Juan, as I said. In this sense, I think it's important to look at this book, The Fire from Within, where Carlos Casteneda writes about the subject of petty tyrants. Because as we have just read from Gurdjieff, it was, in fact, petty tyrants that brought Gurdjieff to his level of understanding, that made him, see things as he saw them, and gave him his unconquerable drive to pursue these two particular aims. And in this in this chapter on petty tyrants in the book The Fire from Within, Casteneda's Don Juan tells us about the seers of the conquest, as he calls it, or the new seers. He says, the new seers recommended that every effort should be made to eradicate self-importance from the lives of warriors. I have followed that recommendation, and much of my endeavors with you has been geared to show you that without self-importance we are invulnerable. And of course you can see that self-importance is undoubtedly what Gurdjieff was referring to when he was talking about he could see how he had done things in his life and followed certain courses of action, but they always ended badly because he was not able to use that hindsight 20/20. Because how many of us, through our own self-importance, do so many things in our lives that hindsight tells us, oh, I shouldn't have done that, I shouldn't have been so proud, I shouldn't have been so arrogant, I shouldn't have been so pushy, I shouldn't have been this, shouldn't have been that, I shouldn't have been stupid. And it's generally self-importance, believing that in the moment, when we are caught up in that moment and caught up in the reactionary nature of our being, that we are in command of ourselves. So Don Juan further says, self-importance can't be fought with niceties. He said that seers, old and new, are divided into two categories. The first one is made up of those who are willing to exercise self-restraint and can channel their activities toward pragmatic goals which would benefit other seers and man in general. The other category of seers consists of those who don't care about self-restraint or about any pragmatic goals. It is the consensus among seers that the latter have failed to resolve the problem of self-importance. And right here you see the difference between, the two approaches, the approach of Gurdjieff and the approach of the work, and the approach of the so-called, New Age navel-gazing crowd. The New Age navel-gazing crowd don't care about self-restraint. They don't care about learning and working. And they certainly don't have any real pragmatic goals. Their goals are for themselves alone. They want to achieve peace, tranquility, and they think, of course, that if they do this, that somehow, some way, it's going to make everything all nice and peaceful all over the world, and they in no way consider the forces of nature and the way the universe wishes to conduct its own activities in the cosmos. And they certainly aren't engaged in any pragmatic goals to help humanity.
Although they claim that they are.
Oh, certainly they claim they are. But pragmatic
They're
means...
going to bring peace to the world by...
Pragmatic means practical, to actually, do something, useful and worth... I mean, it's one thing to sit there and say, okay, we're going to all gather together, we're going to contemplate our navel, and we're going to have, a meditation for world peace. What is pragmatic about that? Absolutely nothing.
Well, it does nothing. And I mean, as a comparison, for example, between a group of people getting together, meditating and hoping that they're going to stop war, and someone writing an essay or an editorial and putting it on a website that exposes the folly of war and the fact that it's being pushed by, which might reach one person who might not go to war and might save their life. And there's a
big
pragmatic
difference, exactly. So, having divided the seers into the old and or into the two categories, he also says about this that self-importance is not something simple and naive. On the one hand, it is the core of everything that is good in us, and on the other hand, it is the core of everything that is rotten. To get rid of the self-importance that is rotten requires a masterpiece of strategy. Seers through the ages have given the highest praise to those who have accomplished it. So then they have a little further discussion, and Carlos Casteneda talks about that he's arguing that admonitions about self-importance reminded him of Catholic die turns. After a lifetime of being told about the evils of sin, that he had become callous. So Don Juan tells him, warriors fight self-importance as a matter of strategy, not principle. Your mistake is to understand what I say in terms of morality. And Castaneda says, I see you as a highly moral man, Don Juan. And Don Juan says, you've noticed my impeccability, that's all. Impeccability, as well as getting rid of self-importance, is too vague a concept to be of any value to me, Carlos says. And then Don Juan says, impeccability is nothing else but the proper use of energy. Now, any of you who have read In Search of the Miraculous and have read the passages that discuss conscience and morality will see that this is exactly the same concept that Don Juan is presenting here. That morality is not the same thing as impeccability, even though it can be perceived as such. Gurdjieff points out that what is moral in China is not moral in America. It's not an objective morality, and searching for an objective morality is, of course, the goal, searching for an objective conscience. He also points out that in terms of what is or is not moral, to somebody who has a definite goal, a definite aim, what is moral becomes anything that furthers that goal, and what is immoral is anything that hinders that goal. And of course, since we understand what Gurdjieff's goal was, which was to understand the nature of the human condition and to awaken people, to help them to overcome the influences of mass hypnosis, you can see that what he would consider to be moral and what he would consider to be immoral would be completely different in many instances from what anybody else would consider to be moral or immoral. So then Don Juan says, warriors take strategic inventories. They list everything they do. Then they decide which of those things can be changed in order to allow themselves a respite in terms of expending their energy. Now this, in a sense, is a very prosaic description of what Gurdjieff was talking about, that he went through this period of meditation, seeing everything he had done and how he could have done it differently, and was in this state of, hyper consciousness, being able to see himself and to see himself seeing himself. And this amounts to, in a certain sense, taking a strategic inventory, listing everything you do or have done, what you can change realistically in order to allow yourselves a respite in terms of your energy. And then he adds that the strategic inventory covers not only behavioral patterns that were not essential to our survival and well-being. So then he says, going on talking about the strategy of becoming free of self-importance and to free up energy for those things that are essential, that is, achieving one's goal, which he has already identified as being goals, doing pragmatic things for the benefit of other seers and for humanity. The strategy is, he says, worked out by the seers of the conquest, the unquestionable masters of stalking. Now, right here we have another clue. Conquest, the seers of the conquest. Now, Gurdjieff was working out his strategy in the midst of wars and revolution and talking to revolutionaries and, under extremely difficult circumstances. So once again, we see a very strong comparison. He says that the strategy consists of 6 elements that interplay with one another. 5 of them are called the attributes of warriorship, and they are control, discipline, forbearance, timing, and will. They pertain to the world of the warrior who is fighting to lose self-importance. The 6th element, which is perhaps the most important of all, pertains to the outside world and is called the petty tyrant. A petty tyrant is a tormentor, someone who either holds the power of life and death over warriors or simply annoys them to distraction. Petty tyrants who persecute and inflict misery but without actually causing anybody's death are the first subclass of petty tyrants. They were called little petty tyrants. The second consisted of petty tyrants who are only exasperating and bothersome to no end. They are called small fry petty tyrants. And he adds that the little petty tyrants are further divided into 4 categories. One that torments with brutality and violence, another that does it by creating unbearable apprehension through deviousness, another which oppresses with sadness, and the last which torments by making warriors rage. So, we see right here that Don Juan is talking about the exact conditions in which Gurdjieff came to his realizations and his understandings, conditions of being exposed to, subjected to petty tyrants. We also see that this is exactly the condition that prevails today on a global scale. In other words, we have the most marvelous petty tyrant that has ever been created, which is the global pathocratic system, the elite system of control, which is trying to basically lead us into a third world war, probably a nuclear war, in which, millions, if not billions, of people will die. This is a fairly good little petty tyrant, as Don Juan would put it. And just to give you an idea, he says, what the new seers had in mind was a deadly maneuver in which the petty tyrant is like a mountain peak, and the attributes of warriorship are like climbers who meet at the summit. Usually only 4 attributes are played. The 5th, will, is saved for ultimate confrontations, such as when warriors are facing the firing squad, so to speak. And those 4 are control, forbearance, discipline, and timing. Anybody who thinks that they are going to operate in this world and bring about any change whatsoever, as Gurdjieff, wished would happen or hoped would happen, which was one of his unconquerable aims to help release people from this mass hypnosis, they're going to have to use control, forbearance, discipline, and timing, and they're definitely going to have to get over their self-importance. So, Don Juan tells us again, one of the greatest accomplishments of the seers of the conquest was a construct called the 3-phase progression. By understanding the nature of man, this is very important, this is a prerequisite, to understand the nature of man, they were able to reach the incontestable conclusion that if seers can hold their own facing petty tyrants, they can certainly face the unknown with impunity and can even stand in the presence of the unknowable. We know that nothing can temper the spirit of a warrior as much as the challenge of dealing with impossible people in positions of power. Only under those conditions can warriors acquire the sobriety and serenity to stand the pressure of the unknowable. And then Don Juan finally adds, he says, let's go back to what I said about the conquest. The seers of that time couldn't have found a better ground. The Spaniards were petty tyrants who tested the seers' skills to the limit. After dealing with the conquerors, the seers were capable of facing anything. They were the lucky ones. At that time, there were petty tyrants everywhere. After all those marvelous years of abundance of petty tyrants, things changed a great deal. Petty tyrants never again had that scope, except now. Of course, at that time that Casteneda was writing this, I'm sure he didn't foresee what was happening in the present time. The perfect ingredient for the making of a superb seer is a petty tyrant with unlimited prerogatives. And so we have a little bit of an understanding of where the work of Carlos Casteneda overlaps the work of Gurdjieff, and even the suspicion that Casteneda may have been influenced by the work of Gurdjieff. Of course, Casteneda asked Don Juan, do petty tyrants sometimes win and destroy the warrior facing them? Of course, and this refers us back to the time of the conquest. There was a time when warriors died like flies at the beginning of the conquest. Their ranks were decimated. The petty tyrants could put anyone to death simply acting on a whim. Under that kind of pressure, seers achieved sublime states. It was then that the surviving seers had to exert themselves to the limit to find new ways to avoid the decimation of their numbers. Well, we can learn from this or we can ignore this, but quite frankly, I think that by comparing what Gurdjieff was about and what Don Juan was writing or saying, being put into what was put into the mouth of Don Juan through the writings of Carlos Casteneda, who I believe was influenced by Gurdjieff, that we're looking at the very same thing at the present time. Don Juan said, the new seers used petty tyrants not only to get rid of their self-importance, but to accomplish the very sophisticated maneuver of moving themselves out of this world. And then Don Juan asks, how do you measure defeat? Anyone who joins the petty tyrant is defeated. To act in anger without control and discipline, to have no forbearance, is to be defeated. And this is what we see to a great extent in the so-called 9/11 truth movement and the anti-war movement and all the different, revolutionary movements. And I believe that that was something that Gurdjieff saw himself and what he was seeing when he was communicating with his so-called revolutionaries. Notice it says to act in anger without control and discipline. It doesn't say that you should never act in anger. Certainly, anger fuels your actions. You must be angry.
How can you look at what's going on in the world
and not be angry? But you must act with control and discipline and forbearance. You must be angry and you must act, you must do, you must have an aim, and that is the true essence of a fourth way work. This was Gurdjieff's fourth way work. It was called a fourth way work because he had a definite aim to help people overcome the mass hypnosis that was leading to the destruction of this earth. This day and this time is the time for a new fourth way work.
And as Castaneda and Gurdjieff both mention, it's essential to understand human nature. But encompassed within human nature is, all of human nature and any natures out there that are not necessarily human-like, which is obviously a reference to our work on psychopathy. It's essential to understand the enemy if you're going to engage in any kind of combat, and also the idea of timing. Obviously, not responding rashly in anger and thereby exposing yourself or setting yourself up for defeat in advance. But understanding human nature will obviously play directly into the idea of timing and how you respond and when you respond and in what way you respond.
Yeah, and when you look at how Gurdjieff describes, a fourth way work, how he describes his own activity, and he talks about, a fourth way work only arises in certain periods of history when there is a particular aim, and it arises surrounding that aim. A group of people have an aim; they have a goal, and this is the essence of the fourth way work. Now, in Gurdjieff's case, he tells us quite clearly what his goals were and why the fourth way schools that exist today do not see the necessity for the use of the gift we have of this wonderful petty tyrant on our planet. His goals were to investigate from all sides and to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man, and to discover at all costs some manner or means for destroying in people the predilection for suggestibility which causes them to fall easily under the influence of mass hypnosis. And that is exactly the work that we are engaged in doing. I mean, both of those goals have been our primary goals from the very beginning. And I will have to say that in my own case, that I began with the first one that Gurdjieff listed, which was to investigate from all sides and to understand the exact significance and purpose of the life of man. And it is only through that and through my use of hypnosis, again, very similar to Gurdjieff, and possibly a psychic ability. I don't claim to be a great psychic, even if I do communicate with myself in the future, but using that in a scientific way to access information. By doing that, I was then led through the activities of communicating with myself in the future to the second goal, which is to find a way to wake human beings up, to destroy this ability of mass hypnosis to control and influence them.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned there's obviously a very direct relationship there between what those two aims of Gurdjieff with the inner and the outer. The first one being to understand the nature of man. Obviously, to understand the nature of man is going for a man or a woman, or to understand the nature of a human being starts with themselves, and the second aim being then to having understood that or made some progress in understanding yourself and understanding other human beings, then to try and find a way to solve the problems that are very clear now. In terms of the kind of work that you mentioned, that this is the work that we are engaged in, I mean, the work with a capital W, this inner work of overcoming self-importance, it's exactly the same as a battle, engaging in a battle and a combat with yourself, because that part of yourself that Casteneda or Don Juan calls the predator's mind it's possessed with exactly the same or very similar types of tendencies as you'll find in an external petty tyrant. The self-interest, the pettiness, the fickleness, the essentially self-importance and self-interest within yourself is what you see in the people that are causing the problems on the planet, that are the bane of humanity. So once you engage in this work with yourself to overcome this and with your own internal petty tyrant, then you're able to you have the skills and you have the experience to effectively combat external petty tyrants.
We see in the 9/11 movement that it's precisely this internal aspect that's missing. There are a bunch of people out there who have seen that there is a mass hypnosis going on, who can see the problems, but because they aren't doing the work on themselves, the 9/11 so-called truth movement,
they have no skills.
They have no skills, and it's rife with infighting. Mm-hmm. It's rife with the problems that come from self-importance.
It's that susceptibility to that they haven't overcome
exactly.
to fool themselves that allows them to be fooled by external forces.
Exactly.
So they're, as Don Juan says, they're defeated before they start.
So if you don't begin by rooting out these aspects of yourself, then the external forces can manifest within you through them. And that's why you have to get rid of them.
And you're like a lamb to the slaughter in terms of your susceptibility to being conned, to having your self-importance or your own ego appealed to. If you haven't dealt with that and understood it and overcome it, then I mean you're lost.
And we've seen this happen to
everybody.
To everybody.
All of them involved in it, exactly.
Yeah.
They're all showing the evidence of self-importance, of self-interest, of ego, and they're not serving anybody. They're not serving humanity. They're serving themselves.
Well, let me just liven this up just a little bit. I don't know if it'll liven it up, but I received a report from one of our members on his experience with a Gurdjieff group, and just to give people an idea of what many of them are into, claiming to be the so-called fourth way, yet not seeming to necessarily have the pressing and unconquerable aims of Gurdjieff. So he writes to me, I went to the work camp of the local Gurdjieffians. They don't occupy themselves with the external terror of the global situation, but I did get to lay stones in a parking lot and to rip out old stones, did heavy work under the burning sun, which was good. I washed dishes and set tables and all manner of things which are good for the soul. And there is an impulse of goodwill towards the fellow man among these people. This creates a shift of emotional atmosphere, which again is good. And constant stress narrows one's range, I notice. So I got to feel sorrow and compassion for the world and such emotions which are normally more dissociated. And then he says, there is an influence that can be felt. Receiving creates an impulse of responsibility and a wish to give back. It is painful to sense, however, that the need for a conscious core is known by these people, but there is a falling apart and a factionalization and a decrease of collinearity between the leaders, and they know it themselves. There is entropy there. And it is not obvious how to help the situation if it could be helped. Some group dynamic does exist. One participant mentioned a vision of being as a member in a structure like an ice crystal, something that was forming even in spite of our egos. A social memory complex, according to Ross, so to say. So there is something, a formation of something that comes from people who come to work together. And there could be something like that, at least transiently, but it is beyond the reach. Then he says, it's almost embarrassing to witness how even between the senior people of this group, miscommunication takes place. Sometimes it is work, sometimes it is being worked upon. Is it through grace or is it through merit? And then he says, these Gurdjieffian people talk a lot about presence and being in the body and sensing. There exists also more thinking-oriented Gurdjieffians, but this branch is that of Madame de Salzman and the late Jean-Claude Lubchansky. So then, he goes on, the emphasis is a lot on the experience and sensing, developing attention, internal discipline in the sense of bringing parts together, not in the sense of beating them up. There is a subtle distinction. It is assumed that the theory is known, so the groups talk about specific personal and practical experience. There were about 70 people there. About half of them were long-time participants of more than 20 years, all staying at this big farm, a big, pretty place with lots of room for this many people. The duration was 8 days. You get up at 6, group meditation at 7, physical work, lunch, group movements, dinner, closing on either side of midnight with a sitting. They do not say meditation, even though people sit cross-legged on cushions in silence. Sometimes there are readings from workbooks, sometimes other joint activity. There's choir practice and performances, cooking, housekeeping, swimming in the river, long days, but not cruel or driving anyone past their limits. That certainly doesn't sound like it's going to do anything like what happened to Gurdjieff himself, or what happened to any of the seers of the conquest, or what we could all accomplish if we make proper use of our current-day petty tyrants.
To finish up for this week, I'd like to get back to something Laura mentioned last week, which was the date of Gurdjieff's experience on the edge of the Gobi Desert, and then his experience some 30 years later when he was writing Life is Real. The date November 6 was also significant for him because in 1927, it was the day that he finished writing his first draft of All and Everything. And in the book, Struggle of the Magicians, William Patterson writes, after 3 years of writing, Gurdjieff completes the first draft of All and Everything, only to then realize that for anyone not personally associated with him, the book will be unintelligible. All and Everything is his legomenism to be understood and actualized in a future time. It is his last means of completing his mission, and it is unreadable. The shock of all the intentional effort he has made since his auto accident, which happened in 1924, the thought of now having to rewrite the whole book suddenly strips him of the one thing that has never failed him, self-remembering. Gurdjieff no longer has the full sensing of the whole of himself. There is nothing to do but to begin again. But his health is bad. He has this foreboding that time is running out. He wrestles with the idea of suicide. Gurdjieff finds himself at what is conceivably the lowest point of his life. Finally, freeing himself from these dark thoughts, he decides to begin the rewriting of all and everything. This is an important day in other respects. Orage and Jesse Dwight. Orage was one of Gurdjieff's main pupils and someone Gurdjieff had worked with very, very closely and had put in charge of the work in the United States. He says, this is an important day in other respects. Orage and Jesse Dwight are in England for his divorce proceedings from his wife, Jean Walker. On this day, his divorce becomes final. Orage has promised Gurdjieff that once the divorce is final, he will come to the Prairie in France. Instead, Orage sends Gurdjieff a wire saying that he and Jesse are sailing back to New York. It's a crucial moment in Orage's life, a definite fork in the road, for he has allowed Jesse to influence him to break his word to his teacher. Another point that Patterson makes in the book is a difference between Ouspensky and Gurdjieff, an important difference. When the Second World War broke out, Ouspensky immediately left and moved to the safety of a farm that was provided for him in New Jersey in the United States. And in doing so, he left about 1,000 students alone to face the consequences of the war in England. And Patterson says that Gurdjieff, when he left Russia, whenever he moved, he brought all the students with him who wanted to come, and he took responsibility for them, feeding, clothing, housing them. And this says something very, very important about Gurdjieff and about his aim.
All of that, what it says to me is that Gurdjieff's life was a pretty difficult one, as we've mentioned. He was led by this inner desire to know and to understand deeper truths, led him into various situations that were very difficult, which in turn crystallized in him this understanding about the nature of life, that it's no walk in the park, and then how to do something about it, and which in turn led him obviously to this inner work, and then to trying to understand how he could essentially convey this to humanity. And he talked about this mass hypnosis, and this is a fairly innocuous term, but this mass hypnosis, we can read into it that Gurdjieff understood that this wasn't a benevolent hypnosis. This was a situation where the masses of humanity were being deceived and hypnotized onto their own destruction. It's the only really logical explanation as to why Gurdjieff was driven to embark on, in later life, his efforts to convey this understanding and this work and this understanding of human nature and the problems of human nature and the problems of life to as many people as possible. And he established his school in France and in America, and this was an impossible task, to try and convey this to ordinary people, and he certainly understood that, but he embarked on it anyway, because he must have seen something extremely negative about the nature of life on Earth and the nature of humanity, and where it's heading and its future. And he talks about a little bit about the future and about at a specific point in time when a need will arise, and that a group of people need to be formed to cater to this need that will arise. And all of it just conveys to me the extreme seriousness of what Gurdjieff understood about life.
One of the ways to form yourself comes in how you look at suffering if there's one thing that's clear in this brief recap that we've given of Gurdjieff's life, it's that he went through a tremendous amount of suffering, and he saw a tremendous amount of suffering in the world. And back on the 6th of November, 1927, when Araj didn't go to the Priory and he took the decision to return with his young wife to New York, Gurdjieff wrote him a letter. The subject of the letter was suffering, and he explained in the letter the difference between voluntary suffering and intentional suffering. There's suffering, and you will not be able to avoid suffering. But what you need to understand is that you can choose your suffering, and by choosing this suffering, you then begin to build that body inside that will align you with truth. And the choice is up to you.
Well, we hope that answers some of our forum members, our readers' questions. As Henry mentioned, if there are any further questions or topics that you want us to discuss, then try and be a little bit more specific, perhaps, if you have a specific interest. But other than that, we're going to leave it there, and we will see you next week.